of Debt Nation, where we are putting death out of business, where we're busy mainstreaming transhumanism, home of all your transhumanist information and news on the USTP. But so we got something interesting here today. We got a lot of libertarians inside transhumanism, a lot of libertarians, and that's good because there's a lot of freedom-based ideas within the transhumanist movement, coming down to morphological freedom, freedom from government, and other ideas. But another thing that's going on is economics. Economics, this transactional relationship that exists between entities, people, governments, other institutions and organizations. Economics is a huge field. It's got lots going on to it. It's the base of most civil societies. And we've got a lot of famous economists as well who have tried to explain economic systems. Adam Smith on the capitalist side, swinging in for capitalism. John Maynard Keynes, this sort of empire economist. And on the other side of the spectrum, this sort of socialist, collectivist ideas. You've got Karl Marx and Engels and others. So we've got two people here to talk about economics today. Welcome, Benzion 2020. Thanks for coming back to the show. As always, all the best with your campaign. And it's Mr. Aditya. He's here. We're going to talk about global capital, global labor markets, the shifting of that sound, that song, dun, 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 money, right? So money's going around the world, and we're going to talk about it. Mr. Aditya, open up. You're from India. You were going to be a broker. You were going to be one of those high flyers. You've chosen something different with yourself, and now you've got something to tell the world. What are you going to tell the world? Welcome to Debt Nation. The reason it's called Debt Nation is because even though we like transhumanism here, we love transhumanism here. The global economic system is underpinned by movements of debt and the flow of debt, and it's how we've got to where we are. That's how it works. So, Mr. Aditya, explain your background, who you are, and what you've come to tell the world.
Yeah, I am actually 35 years old now. So when I was a teenager, I grew up in India in the 90s. And that was a time when the economy, after 30 or 40 years of extreme socialism, they decided to open it up to capitalism. And I grew up in like this tiny capitalist pocket in Bombay, which is it's the largest, it's the financial hub of India. And if I did it, I'd be a third or fourth generation stockbroker. So, my background was deeply embedded inside the capitalist society of Bombay. And at that time, for many years, everything related to capitalism had really been throttled. Coca-Cola had been thrown out like 20 or 30 years. All the visible symbols had been thrown out. On top of that, if you're in any kind of industry, most forms of advertising were prohibited. So, it was really very tamped down. And all of a sudden, over the period of a few years when I was a teenager, it really opened up. So when I grew up in where I grew up, we saw this as a huge celebration. And actually, Bombay, for a long time, it was the head of cotton exporting from the whole of India, which, I told this to Ben before. Actually, Bombay became a huge hub for cotton export after the US Civil War stopped cotton export from the United States. So the British Empire needed another resource, so they just switched from the west to the east. And that's when Maharashtra, where I grew up, Bombay, sugarcane and cotton became huge crops, and these huge mills developed in the middle of the city. So when I grew up, these mills were still all over the middle of the city. But at this time, most of them were being run by the government as non-performing corporations. They were called NPCs. And most of these mills were failing, but the government would keep them open, or in many cases just keep them shuttered, but keep paying the workers, so that the workers would continue to be able to live in their assisted housing, and the workers would continue to have uniforms, and their children would continue to go to the school, their school, special schools set up for the workers. Because when these mills were originally built, they had to bring migrant workers in as well. So they built a whole system to take care of them right next to where their workplace. And the system was still maintained by the government, even though it was non-performing. And so when I grew up, I always thought that, hey, we've got the internet, we've got capitalism again. right? So surely we can find a way to take all these masses of poor people. In particular, I was focused on like domestic staff, like people who work in other people's homes. Surely we can find some way to take all this technology and capitalism and use it to employ all these people who work in a sector of labor in India we call unorganized labor, and get them low paying but good jobs like the ones that are now gone away from the mill but the government still props up through the unions. Like how do I take vast fleets of unorganized labor and help them migrate to organized labor? um, and basically I thought, whoa, like the best way to do this is to enable service delivery through the internet. This was like 2001 or 2002, and my idea was like, actually there was no mobile internet at the time. I was like, wow, this means you can go down to the corner store, to the Xerox shop, like the photocopy shop, and you can just tell the guy like, hey, can I have, a plumber, a painter, somebody to clean my garage? And he's just going to type on the computer and give you a receipt, and 2 hours later all these people in uniform will show up to work at your establishment. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. This is like an insane way, great way, decentralized way to manage like large fleets of labor and give people dignity. Like they can work when they want. They'll probably have uniforms. They'll be trained in these, fairly unskilled trades, but it's better than what other people are doing. Anyway, I spent a long time in my life trying to do this. I moved to the United States. But then in 2014, what happened is that finally, after many years, thanks to the profusion of smartphones, both Uber and Amazon launched in India, and within a year, India became the #3 marketplace in the world for both those companies. So all of a sudden, venture capitalists and everybody got excited. They started to believe that Indian people are actually ready to order goods and services on demand using their smartphones. And at the same time, a friend of mine, he and his brother have built from scratch a 2,500 person strong facilities management company that's very reputed in Bombay. So VCs were coming to him and they were like, hey, why don't you take your existing fleet of facilities management staff for corporations and just pivot some of it on demand and sell it to homes under a brand name Mr. Homecare. And he knew that I had always wanted this job, so he called me up and I was like, yeah, I'll see you next week. And, I moved to India. I gave up everything in Los Angeles. I packed my stuff up and I moved to India. And we spent about a year trying to make this work, offering like 5 or 7 different services, using his fleet, using another network of about 30,000 other people in a vendor network that he was already using heavily, just trying to aggregate them all. When we couldn't generate enough demand through our own site, we started reselling and white labeling our fleet on behalf of 8 or 10 other companies. And so we were even getting a good order volume. And we'd never thought this through before, the numbers would never actually add up. Like we had the amount that we'd paid the employees in wages, and we managed to do all right because we were attached to this, large company. So we weren't like losing money hand over fist. But fundamentally, and I guess, in most businesses, you would have done this sort of analysis before you even started. But we were so enamored by this business. It was such a national service for all of us that we didn't really drill down to the correct level. But, long story short is it just isn't actually profitable to run a business that sells people's labor on demand for unskilled trades such as cleaning in India. It just isn't, simply because the wages that we pay these people is too low. And so the margin that you earn on their backs is too little to, fund a reasonably sized team to manage them. And when I discovered this firsthand, like this has been my lifelong dream, like to enable this, it was just like a really rude shock to me. And it started to have me question everything I knew about labor and capitalism. Like what is the minimum wage? What is the work week? What's it all about? And basically that's how I ended up here today.
So you have massive amounts of people in India. I mean, it's a hugely populated country, and your dream was to liberate a lot of those people via a sort of a capitalist idea, to give them all jobs. What about if you just raise the wage artificially to incentivize them to work? Would that work?
Well, I mean, you have a similar problem in all these trades, which is that the actual consumer is extremely demanding. So they're demanding both on price and in quality. Like if you think about yourself, when you opt for an in-home service such as cleaning, you both expect an extremely low price and you expect an extremely absurd level of quality. And if either is wrong, you're going to ditch the organization that, betrayed you just right off the bat. It really is a commodity service at the end of the day, and people are not willing to spend more to choose a brand they trust.
Because like I've had a similar idea, and because like I was living in an area where I was looking at either buying a cleaning franchise, one of these ones in Australia, where you basically rent out a zone, and then you buy a franchise, and it's a well-known franchise, and you basically guaranteed work, and if you complete that work, you'll get a margin. And you can hire employees to help you and all this. I was either looking at that, or I was looking at doing a decentralized model on my own for a cleaning franchise. So basically what I was thinking of doing is either developing an app or just using flyers, just distributing the flyers around the area that I lived in, the absolute vicinity, and then just for some extra cash, undercutting everybody else's prices by like 10. So like these guys will do your lawn for $50. I'll do it for $10. So you'd have vast amounts of work, but I didn't do it because when I was too busy working my regular job, and so actually working that job would have just been just a waste of my time and labor and all that other stuff. But two, it's impossible to actually hire people on an app for that price. I did all the math on it, and yeah, it just wouldn't work. But in India, there's a big middle class there. So you're saying that even with these really, really low rates, the math doesn't work?
Yeah, that's so yeah, the whole business is built upon a margin, but as you correctly pointed out, it's extremely competitive on the front end. But the thing is, the labor is paid so little in India that one, of course, somebody who's unorganized can probably do it cheaper. Like we have a reputation, we have 2,500 people. If something goes wrong, so we have to pay our workers a certain amount. But some pop-up shop of like 5 or 6 people can just find somebody off the street and be like, hey, you do the job. And then if something bad happens, they're not concerned about the consequences. So they're able to go even seemingly cheaper, but there's no regulation or protection in this sector for like the workers have to be certified or.
So it's kind of this inverse correlation where the larger you get, the more risk you take on, and because the margin is so small, with the taxes and the liabilities that you start to assume, it doesn't actually end up working out.
Yeah, it's mostly the liabilities because people don't realize this, but India is actually a very fair tax country. It's become one. So like the government we have now in the last 3 or 4, actually the big story of the government that India has right now is that over the last 3 or 4 years that they've been in power, they have undertaken some incredibly major structural reforms, each of which was built to be the one that sets the economy on fire. But instead, they have encountered no growth, and they've encountered So the thing is, the whole thing of opening up the economy by itself is a lie.
I've been watching Narendra Modi very closely. He sat there with the New York Times. He was trying to be a Western man. He was trying to be an educated figure. He was trying to be the economy guy. He did the currency reform. Where he tried to get a lot of the black market money out. He's done stuff on labor relations and liberalization. Yeah, but it hasn't translated. It hasn't, India is no China, unfortunately. And I love India personally. It's a good country for us here in Australia. We're very culturally connected, economically connected, politically connected. We do a lot of trade between our two countries, and it's no China, unfortunately.
Yeah, and middle class has been created. But corporate India probably has no more than 10 or 20 or even 30% more jobs than it did in like 2004, honestly. And, the rest of the country has only gone backwards, to be honest, since 2004 in terms of financial. Like they intellectually, it's opened up a bit, but then, because of the smartphone in particular. But then, contrary to that, the air pollution is horrendous and the environment has been destroyed. So, is it a win? Is it a loss? I don't know. It's really some kind of draw. But the underlying point is that by itself, capitalism does not seem to be uplifting anybody because now, if you want to start a business, you just can. probably take you like 2 days to get started. If you want a small business loan, you can just get one. The problem is almost no small business pays enough margin. And once you find yourself in a hole, India has real interest rates. Like even a small business loan will be like 9, 10, 12%. So, once you get into a hole, especially if you're on the low end of the spectrum, that entire class of the micro entrepreneur, like the person who, sells stuff and just, hustles their way to a higher class, those people are just not succeeding. Them ending up mired in credit card debt and, owning like all these assets they can't afford to pay for. And yeah, all the growth in wealth in India has come from finance and real estate, like everywhere else.
So yeah, Ben Zion, we better bring him into the conversation because he's sitting there very patiently. But Aditya, like, because you've straddled both countries, you straddled India and the United States. Now, can you open up for Ben on this one and tell us what you see in America? Do you see any of these problems in the United States? Ben Zion is the USTP's endorsed candidate for the presidential election of the United States. So can you give him some economic advice of what you see between the difference between the Indian economy and socialism, these topics relating to the United States and what you see going on? And then Ben, you can respond.
I just really wanted his perspective on what his solutions would be to this problem, because as I see it, this problem actually is rampant all over the United States already. Particularly in agricultural labor, but also in like auto parts and stuff. It's linked to the problem of like, you can always move labor to a cheaper jurisdiction. So like with NAFTA, so many jobs move to Mexico or whatever. But I mean, yeah, the fundamental problem remains the same. The people who are working minimum wage, they can't seem to find a way to a higher place in the economic system. And, how exactly will the transnational party do that?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And even if they were to do that, there is the problem that under an economic system, it should be like if there's free trade, there must be free labor in order to equalize the effects of what I was just talking about. And so if you are going to have open borders, just assume that as a constraint. Like if there's a job for someone, anyone from all over the world could come and fill that job. So with that as a constraint, how could the Transhumanist Party address this problem of just this lower class that just, they're precariat. They just keep working and they can't really afford to live.
Yes. In the United States, and particularly in the developing world and in countries that have seen advances like those that you described, we do see these oblong and imperfect manifestations of globalization, in a word. I don't really like that word that much, but that's pretty well what we're talking about if we're using shorthand. And this is a serious consideration. And I don't know that you're going to like my first response, Aditya, because the first conversation we had was particular to United States domestic policy and a Social Security for all program in the form of the federal land dividend, which I've described at great length on this show a number of times. But my feeling is that we are looking at, this is the story of the 20th century, this bottoming out of labor rights, in a word, this effect of seeing outsourcing and seeing, more important than outsourcing, far more important, automation and similar effects, causing us to have a country now where 55% of workers are working in service jobs. They're earning artificially low wages. They have artificially high housing costs. And lo and behold, in the next 15 years, almost all of those jobs are going to be automated out of existence. We don't have any contingency plan in place to deal with this. A Social Security for All program, like the federal land dividend, which is funded through the leasing of these federal lands, which are held in great number to other institutions, would solve some of these problems. As far as labor relations internationally, that's a more complicated question, and that's one that I hope to arrive at some better solutions in the course of this conversation. I do feel that I don't know how far it goes to address these concerns, but I feel that greater liberalization of visa programs than have existed in the present and most recent administrations would do something to address these concerns, but perhaps not be doing nearly enough. What else would you propose if you were in charge of such an international labor initiative, Aditya?
I mean, the thing is that one thing, and I don't know about solutions just yet. One thing is like, for example, one thing that in India could fix a lot of people's problems would be like a 3 or 4 day work week, right? Because the minute you made the work week 3 days or 4 days in India, you would actually literally double the number of jobs available because, there's so many unemployed people. And, but the thing is, because of the same pressures that you just described, that because we're tied to one globalized economy, and that globalized economy these days pushes people who are doing manual labor or semi-skilled labor to do 5 or often 6 days of work a week. Otherwise, their jobs will literally move to another country and will be gone altogether. I'm not really sure how any country, including the United States, can really afford to draw those hard borders. Right? That's the problem that I just don't understand how it can be solved.
Yeah, I think that a good deal of porousness here, and certainly a high level of openness to different approaches so far as allowing tech workers. We have a situation just in looking at some specific discipline like analytics. Or some others in computer science, we have a situation where just in the last year, China has been able to lure a lot of people away from the United States, doing precisely what the United States has done in other countries, and luring others who would tend to have gone to the United States. So we need to make sure that we still continue to put a premium on this type of human capital. This is the most important segment of the marketplace, in my view. There's so many other ways in which the United States, for cultural reasons or for other kinds of provincial notions, might not tend to be at the head of the spear with these things relative to China, for example. So we really need to see that we do focus on that. But this is a separate matter from also seeing that that workers are treated well and able to live well. And this is also the most important thing that government should be doing. And so I do applaud you for being able to look at these different economic theories and sort of try to incorporate them into a 21st century model. I think that's the most important thing that we can do, particularly as we're talking about this post-industrial and even full automation framework that we're moving into the second part of the 21st century. We need to consider how these alternate approaches or these varied approaches from other theories of governance and economics fit into that.
I think you hit on something there, an improvement of human capital. Aditya, what do you think, how much do you think education has a responsibility, the government education and or private education, because you're concerned about manual labor, upskilling your human capital stock, a good idea?
Yeah, so that's very interesting thing. So after the actual startup in manual labor, in actually employing people through semi-skilled labor and having them do more on-the-job training, it turned out a wash. That company is still doing very well. They've actually tripled in size. They now have 7,500 people in their workforce. So, they continue to grow, just not as explosively as the internet should, in theory, enable, and in, certain market categories. But what I decided to do after that was, well, the other problem is all these people who are working in all these jobs, they're all working 5 or 6 days, more likely 6 days a week. So they don't have time to educate themselves unless their employers are going to give them time off, which their employers cannot do. So I moved on to the next thing, which is, okay, so if you can't actually, educate people, you can optimistically at least inspire people to want to educate themselves. Or, you can work on K through 12, which is a different category where children do have time to learn.
Aditya, before we get on to what you did, I have to ask a question. So put this, and once you answer this question, we can go back to where you were going. And I don't mean to be rude, but how much does the caste system or domestic policy, like the caste system, have to do with what you're talking about? Is this unique to, because we've got the same problems across the world now, and you're talking about competition of labor and stuff like that. But Is the caste system? Does the caste system have an impact on this? And then after you finish that, you can go back to
No.
what you were trying to do.
Actually, not at all, because these laborers are all mixed caste. They've all just migrated together to the city. So, and actually, that Karl Marx had mentioned this. The caste system was brutal. It is an evil. It's part of a feudal society. Like, it's a class of really low serfs, basically, is one way to think about it, right? But then by the same standard, I don't even know why I'm getting, every feudal society had a large class of slaves or really low serfs, indentured slaves, right? So that's all that the caste system is in the context of India, and it's smaller than it was in most places, but it still was extremely large, and still many evil effects of it persist to this day. But I think it's one thing that in India, through affirmative action, economically, it's been obliterated.
All right,
Socially, it
fantastic.
still exists in corners, yeah, but economically, it's been obliterated.
All right, cool. So continue. So thank you very much for answering that.
Yeah. So, but what is interesting is that Karl Marx, actually, we call this. I just started revisiting communism, at least Karl Marx and the foundational text, just to understand what the situation was then. And one of the points he makes fairly frequently is that previous societies had many modes of gradated social organizations, like knights, chevaliers, like all these different classifications of order, right, in the pre-economic. And it's the bourgeois system that has reduced the majority of human relations to being strictly transactional. And the only difference between you and me is that I'm worth more, or you're worth less, or you work for me, or you don't, right? So I just found that quite interesting, because that's definitely the case in India and worldwide too. Like, all these people are one category of semi-skilled labor that is on the lower end. And even in that category, you can split it up into the type of people who, refuse to work, like they're actually criminal in intent or mind or whatever, and another category where they want to get ahead, but they just are stuck in this awful treadmill that goes nowhere and leaves them no time to think. And I would say the vast majority of people are in this situation. In India would be the vast majority. In America, it would be the simple majority of people who are stuck in this place.
Ben, did you want to say anything?
Oh yeah, I did have a question. I wondered, Aditya, if you'd like to comment. I know that there have been some various pilot programs of different kinds in India, some along these lines. A friend of the show, a fine futurist organizer in his own right, Jason Mallory, has promoted something like a robot tax, if I'm not mistaken. We could describe that at greater length. You've described how India has in some ways been at the forefront of digitalization throughout various sectors, and yet the citizenry haven't benefited from that. Do you think something like a robot tax could be a solution in a place like India?
Again, I don't think so, because there's so many of these jobs that I'm actually working as a robotics engineer myself, and there's a lot of semi-skilled jobs that robots just can't do yet because of X or Y or Z. And as we start to replace many of these semi-skilled jobs, I see more semi-skilled jobs emerging, for example, in the maintenance of robots, right? So I think that point that you made earlier, which is about, really unleashing technology workers and unleashing foreign entrepreneurs in the United States, because, in Western countries, foreign entrepreneurs are able to create, because of established systems of capital, develop markets, and just a whole host of other tools, including one that I'm going to mention in particular. When you allow a foreign entrepreneur to succeed in a Western context, they're able to create immense value that they would not be able to do at home, because the system that they're doing so in is just so much more developed, right? But I think the critical thing that we're missing in this picture is honestly affordable housing. So even in the United States, if we were to look at just the domestic policy of the United States, just the way I see the economy shaping up, it's creating jobs at an incredible pace that pay pretty good money. But all of those jobs are concentrated in 20 agglomerations. Like the San Francisco Bay Area would be the number one, right? And that's the place where there's the least housing. So even if you are to accept that this economy is going to change and create enough jobs for everybody on its own, which in the case of the United States domestically is, I don't know if it's true, but it's definitely running in that direction, and you should enable it. But that would still mean an amazingly huge migration from certain parts of the country to another, where at this time there's no housing whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. Aside from the question of this robot tax or some kind of basic income scheme that's funded in this way, do you see any other potentials in India for some kind of leapfrogging?
So free trade, like I said, needs free labor, because that otherwise you're denying labor their rights, right? You're pushing all the people who get paid the least to another jurisdiction where they have less rights, right? So one of the biggest things that you can do to enable people, which is going back to my point, is give them the freedom to actually move around, right? So actually building transport that's cheap for commuting is huge, along with affordable housing, and along with the visas. Like the three actually go together, because if you can't actually go to where the job is, then there's no job for you, and you can't be part of this system of equalization.
And we should also say that a free transportation system of that kind has been implemented in many countries, also as a greening effort, because it is. But it should be viewed also primarily as this kind of poor tax. People are paying a lot of money, and they don't have that ability to move around. But that's maybe a little bit of an aside.
If California was a sane state and not falling off the rails, following the United States, then they would immediately build a bullet train from Sacramento to San Francisco, just because the whole Sacramento area has become a bedroom community for San Francisco. And for reasons all of us understand, people don't want to overdevelop, the incredibly beautiful Northern California. So they should just connect it to Central California, like simple, plan solved, like just solved. There's really not much to it except, a complete lack of political ability to deliver.
What would you say, Aditya, that the currency system, so the rupee versus the US dollar, this is another form of imperialism, if you want to call it that, and or natural form of capitalism. So the currency, the Modi and the guys there at the Central Bank of India are always trying to devalue the currency in order to stimulate and cheapen their labor rates. What do you say to the currency mechanisms?
Well, to this, I'd like to draw back to, let me just look up how to say his name, the Greek finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis.
Oh, yeah, Varoufakis, yeah.
Yeah, he has a book that has been very influential in my life. It's called The Meek Must Suffer What They Must. And it basically, in that he explains why the European area is structurally designed in such a way that poorer countries will just keep getting poorer and amass more debt, and richer countries will just keep getting richer, just simply for the fact that the industrial bases and the innovation hubs are all located in some countries. They're located in these dense centers, which were built before the euro area, and the currency system doesn't allow for mechanisms for money to flow back in order to reach the people from whom it was extracted. So both the euro and the US dollar are very much imperialist tools. I don't know if they were consciously implemented as such. In the case of the dollar, they consciously were, but for the purpose of spreading freedom, not for the purpose of complete economic control. But it's been twisted into where that's what it's become. And in the case of the euro, it's just some kind of strange, bureaucratic munge over there, but the effect is the same. All the actual value keeps going back to Germany, Holland, and certain other parts of Europe, and countries like Greece are basically never going to ever get out of debt, and their workers are just going to keep getting poorer and poorer. So it's the same thing with India and the US when it comes to the dollar, unfortunately, and it's the same reason why India can't really embark on any really innovative domestic labor proposals that would break the hegemony of the global economy, because the minute they do that, their currency will just go off the rails.
Yeah, and why has China done what China's done as opposed to what India's done? I mean, India has favorable geography. India is a big country, just like China. It's not quite as close to the United States in terms of shipping, so let's rule that out. But why is China able to do what it's done and India done what it's done?
In my opinion, the Chinese Communist Party, at some point, after 1992, they have studied the entire system of the global economy, and they have consciously decided to raise China up by pursuing an extreme policy of manufacturing at all costs. And I think this policy, although it's probably been devastating to wide swaths of the environment in China, economically, it's been a tremendous success. Like it really has been. So the fact that it's a planned state economy and they plan to take their place and exert their value in the global economy through this means of becoming the world's manufacturing hub is really what has enabled the Chinese economy to rise. In the case of India, the government is and always has been both venal and incompetent. So we still, till date, people are hoping they've not caught up to the place where perhaps I'm at, which is they're hoping that by itself, open regulation and capitalism will somehow lift people up. This, by the way, is the promise that free trade, was sold on. That if you just open up your markets, you just reform your labor laws, you just roll back your government spending, then all of a sudden, by itself, people are just going to get richer and happier and more educated because they're going to have more jobs and they're going to have more freedom to choose between jobs and they will be able to spend more in the market. And, there's this whole dream that's sold. And in the case of every country that's actually followed those steps, I don't know there must be exceptions, but in general, I find that the country tends to suffer greatly when they do that. And it's usually a very bad idea. So in India's case, that's exactly what's happened. This government has finally done that, many years too late, but we still have a huge wage advantage. You would imagine that we would just keep catching up. There's so much drama between the US and China. You would imagine that, they would, move all the facilities to India, but they don't.
I think it bears mentioning also that China is a fairly extreme outlier in terms of these growth numbers, and that that India is no slouch in this regard. There's not really, aside from China, there's not really countries that have seen those growth numbers to the extent that India has. So this is a success story in its own right.
Well, no, that's what I'm saying. I don't think India is a success story at all.
No?
I mean, it's not a success story. It's just any other country in Southeast Asia, and even India's closest countries like Bangladesh have done much better in terms of the actual earning per worker. Most of the growth in India's wealth come from just growth in the value of real estate.
Yeah, and that's a failure in people's thinking in the United States. Almost. It's incredibly widespread.
Well, growth.
The Dow Jones is the indicator of the health of people in this core century.
Yeah, actually, it's an indicator of theft. Not always. It's an indicator of many things, right? But when it's artificially growing at the rate that it has consistently over time, it's an indication of huge amounts of wealth transfer.
Yes,
is what it is.
Yeah. It is. It's a wealth transfer from. From the bottom 90% to the top 10%, or the bottom 99% to the top 1%, whatever your theory is. Yeah. So India is an interesting country because it speaks English in the majority. Therefore, it's easy for foreign companies, especially Bretton Woods type companies, to come in. What do you think? We've talked about education. We've talked about currency. Domestic labor laws, domestic transformation. Now, you keep harkening back to Karl Marx and socialism. Now, India went through a period of socialism, sort of didn't work. Now, this period of liberalization is done a half a good job, not as good as you would like. So, what's your idea? You've got three things. You've got housing affordability. What was the other two things? You've got housing affordability. Your other two points were
transport was a big one.
Transport, and the other one was.
Well, I have both free labor and I believe in a really high minimum wage.
Okay, so we got transport. Let's go through each of these points. Transport, high minimum wage. Okay, so let's start off with the minimum wage argument. Where is the minimum wage in India now, and where would you like to see it in order to promote maximum efficiency?
I mean, the literal minimum wage in India is just absurdly low.
Yeah.
I know that when I was there in 2014, and wage growth in India is very slow. So it's really actually okay. So what I was most shocked by was that when I left the country in 2002, and then I would keep coming back to visit, but around then, a decent wage was about 20,000 rupees a month, right? And then when I came back to actually work in India in 2014, the same wage was maybe 30,000 rupees a month. So even though the economy had these tremendous growth numbers, in the span of a decade, wages have only gone up like 1.5 times, right? And basically,
which
just
is
to give you
actually
context,
declined when you account
yeah,
for
which has actually
inflation.
declined, and
Yeah,
in
and the
India, the
GDP
rate
had
of
grown as to
inflation
what?
has been huge. So actually, money has come out of the pockets of workers in
It's a
massive
tax.
amounts.
It's a tax.
It's just like everywhere else, goods made in
Yeah.
China are so absurdly cheap. Materially, they can afford more,
Mm.
right? So, but actually, that's also an artificial, like a fake situation. So the two fake situations like feed on each other. But yeah, so basically, a janitor in India makes 421 US dollars a month.
Mm.
Actually, I forget my exact calculations, but I mean, for that to be competitive with even Vietnam, like in terms of a living standard, that number would have to triple.
Mm. You know,
So the idea about minimum wage. Sorry, Ben.
please
I'll
go.
let you go in a sec, and we'll talk about U.S. minimum wage as well in a second. So the idea would be that the security analysts would be looking at this. You know, the north and south of India are completely different parts of the country. They don't even have the same language a lot of the time. They don't like the people in the south usually don't like the rulers in the north. You know, I know. I've seen the photos with the bullet holes and the you know the crosses of Narendra Modi in the south. So the idea might be that wouldn't they be worried over there at the Department of Labor if they raise the minimum wage? They might put more people out of employment. They might create more unemployment, which might create social instability. Is that an argument? Is that a point?
Well, here's one thing I'd just like to point out, that the actual minimum wage in India is about $55 or $60 a month. So the amount that I gave you is the amount that's being paid in a metro area to a janitor. And honestly, there's no reason that, you know, somebody should pay even a janitor so much, except that, you know, it ends up being like, what's the minimum such a person really needs to scrape by? Because, you know, you can't be paying them much less than that, or they'll keep disappearing. And actually, that ours is a very reputable company. Like I said, the others who are in lower categories are just very reputable, very honest company. But others who are, you know, more disorganized or more crooked, they would just pay less, and then the actual workers do just disappear because all of a sudden, like, you know, some sort of warrant just jumped up on somebody that they couldn't afford to deal with, or, you know, situations like that.
You mentioned 30,000 rupees. What would that translate to in dollars approximately?
420.
Okay, so that's an eightfold difference there. Wow. Yeah.
So
that's a good thing you hit on. So in technology workers, the same effect prevails because the economy is actually doing so badly. So I was a high value technology worker in the United States and then a high value technology worker in India. And aside from an extremely slim class of people who managed to peg their wages to US wages, honestly, there's not more than 20,000 people in the whole country who fit into that category, right? Because they're working for such multinational corporations or such prestigious institutions that they're able to do that because they would just quit and go somewhere else, right? Everybody else, your normal technology worker, like your entry-level software engineer, earns less than 1/3, between 1/5 and 1/3 of what his or her their US counterpart makes. And when you go down to semi-skilled, it goes to 8 to 15 times. 1/8 to 1/15.
So what about my question about if you raise the minimum wage, would you create instability which the central government, New Delhi, wouldn't want?
I mean, we have in New Delhi and most of North India and most of India, the world's now officially worst air pollution. And the majority of it is because farmers burn their fields in a very illogical way. Personally, I view that as just extreme frustration with their subsistence lifestyle, because as I pointed out, this is something that's been invisible to many people. These farmers are literally half as rich, they're twice or 3 times as poor as they were in 2004 because of this wage extraction.
And you know, other approaches.
Oh, sorry.
Other approaches to this, one which you alluded to, you know, I know that Aditya and myself historically have taken some interest in the work of Democrats, particularly Senator Sanders, as a presidential candidate. And in recent months, Senator Sanders has proposed a $1 trillion housing for all guarantee, a multi-trillion-dollar program. Also has historically supported a federal jobs guarantee. These are alternative approaches that might have some a possible application in India that would be able to conceivably work around this concern about setting off some kind of chain reaction of hyperinflation or
major problem
concerns
in
that Steele
India,
described.
you can't create jobs without knowing how to pay for them in the international financial system.
Yes.
So the government can't arbitrarily, just guarantee more jobs and then be like, we'll finance that with debt, because it can't do that. It has to pay interest on the debt. It can't even afford the interest payments.
So you would draw a distinction between doing that in a more developed country and in India, certainly?
No, it's simply just in the United States, because the United States dollar is the world's reserve currency. So that's the only place on earth you can just infinitely expand the balance sheet of the government and people just let it go.
I'm inclined to
some limit. But yeah, every other country in the world has to reckon with, if we just add too many fake jobs, then who's going to pay for them?
Yeah, I'm inclined to think that there's an awful lot of cushion there. We saw many trillions of dollars of devaluation and quantitative easing that occurred in the wake of the housing crisis in 2009, and there was it didn't really make a dent. We have this fintech-run economy. But there's got to be a limit, right?
I really honestly, like everyone else, just don't know.
Yeah.
That really is an unexplored topic. I mean, what definitely there's going to be a limit in terms of what else the government can do, because they've spent all their money doing this. Right. So I just don't know. I mean, as such, like, the organization of humans together, human capital is, just potentially infinite. Right. That's the Transhumanist Party, especially if we all extend our lives and, just better manage our shared resources. So there's an Italian economist. Her name's something Marziotti, I think. She's American Italian. Or French Italian, and she's really I'm just looking for a name. I had it pulled up earlier. She has a new theory of economics which is very popular, which says that developed countries should actually have the state dynamically invest in vast new frontiers in order to develop them for everybody, and that this is the way forward. So that would be exactly what you're saying. Instead of spending all this money on foreign wars or QE, we could be spending it on better science, better roads, better development of human capital.
Yes,
and I personally, yes, I completely agree with this.
Yeah, it pays incredible dividends, and just in the way that you've talked about these 20th century mechanisms of, for example, these international bodies, which would claim to be advancing labor and development in these other countries, but in fact have this sort of neoliberal stranglehold on those processes in practice over the decades. If we allow these sort of economic conservatives, people who claim to be economic conservatives, to naysay every sort of undertaking, we pay a great toll in human development, and the dividends that are paid by allowing those projects to advance. This is in the context of a basic income, for example. This is precisely why conservative economists like Milton Friedman supported it, because all of those people starting small businesses and participating more fully in the economy, it'll pay off tremendously.
All right, that's cool. Ben, quickly, just tell us about the Ben Zion 2020 minimum wage and your reflections, your comments on the minimum wage in the United States. We've got India's perspective. Thank you very much, Ben.
Yes. Well, I would like to say that the efforts in the United States, and many of them are quite localized, to advance minimum wage. So, for many municipalities have passed legislation for a $15 minimum wage, and we've made a lot of great advances to seeing this. I would continue to support those, as I always have. As we know, the Futurist New Deal for America, my platform focuses on other kinds of economic reforms, namely a federal land dividend, which I think is the better short-term strategy to seeing that we strengthen our middle class and see that it doesn't continue to erode as it has dramatically. But that's not to say that this is these two kinds of efforts are diametrically opposed. We need to continue to support raising wages across this country as well. And my support of the federal land dividend has always been a kind of calculation. We have a tremendous amount of special interests in this country that are basically able to micromanage the government at the federal level, and this is so much the case that we have a kind of wholesale subversion of democracy. We have all kinds of mechanisms that we see like this, and we could start open war, so to speak, with these folks, and we should. But something like the federal land dividend, it does not force that conflict. What it does is it finds a novel mechanism to deal with this problem, and in time we can address the other concerns as well. So I think to some degree we might think of wages, particularly to the United States, in this way. But we need to be supporting folks who are fighting for workers in any way that we can.
All right.
I think.
Sorry, go, Aditya.
Yeah, so this economist, I don't know her work, but I just read about her in the New York Times. Her name's Mariana Mazzucato. I don't know her ideas well enough to properly discuss them. But I think one of the headline things that she says is the most urgent thing that we have to deal with in this era is, how can we actually help workers organize democratically? Because that's the one thing that they are completely failing to do in every system that we've mentioned so far. I don't know about completely failing, but like you said, this fight for minimum wage is finally gaining some sort of traction, but it's not really going beyond the right to work, extreme hours. Then people are not really talking about like, well, now how do I go back to school? Or, how do I, just do other things? How do I retrain myself for a better career? I think that needs to be a real focus, that if we can help enable that in any way, especially transnationally, then people will, tend to work out these things as best as they can, at least on a, by themselves. They're just not organized at all right now.
Before we... Oh, sorry, Ben. You go.
Oh, no, I just had a little bit of an aside. Last night I was talking to some folks who were setting up a meeting about a think tank that's being developed in conjunction with the World Transhumanist Parties. And we were talking about other think tanks here in Phoenix. There's a Goldwater Institute. We are also talking about partners in Canada, the Fraser Institute. These two are basically, they purport to be libertarian or decentralizing forces, but they're basically trust busters. And we're kind of, again, like the kind of a trap that Aditya is describing is something that it would be nice to be able to work with people who are really interested in elevating the human condition and not merely destroying workers' rights. We need to find ways to strengthen workers' rights in all of these institutions.
All right, so before we go on to Indian transport, another thing you mentioned was housing affordability and the housing crisis, Aditya. So expand on this notion of housing in India, affordable housing for labor rights, etc.
In India, actually, it's a shocking story. I suppose not shocking, given the government has failed in so many aspects, but there's almost no affordable housing built. So actually, like in Mumbai, for as long as I've lived there, when I lived there, over half the population of the city lives in a slum. Even in South Africa and some other countries that I've visited, the slums themselves have been regularized. But in India, they fail to even regularize the slums. So, you could have slums that actually have plumbing and sewage and decent public health. And in India, we do, but it only advances because of public health. Like if there's an epidemic, in order to avoid an epidemic, it'll just be cleaned up just enough. But it doesn't actually go past that to actually, make people's living situation livable. I've come to understand that all of the affordable housing problems not all, but the fundamental problem with affordable housing everywhere is simply that land use is not permitted for affordable housing. Like full stop, that's it. Every place I've lived in, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Mumbai, people have talked about affordable housing. and they've said, oh, there's a shortage of land, there's a shortage of land. But then in each of these cities, there's a huge deindustrialized area that just lies completely fallow. That could be an entire mega city. You could fit the whole of Singapore and like South San Francisco, right? But just land use policy is not there. So I don't think there's much to housing. In the same way America was settled, you just let people go. You like show up, here's your land, build it. I think with affordable housing, you need a little more organization than that. People need to build like 6-story hotels, fine, but that's not really complicated in the human scheme of things. These things pop up like measles anywhere you let people do them, right? So the problem is literally just the land use and the permitting.
Yeah, in Los Angeles, I can think of a number of municipal initiatives that were basically scuttled by the kind of forces that you're describing, where there was something that was going to be built that would be affordable public housing, and upper middle class organizers saw that project never came to fruition.
Yeah, Los Angeles is a bit of a better story because it's run by a cabal of real estate developers. So there is much more housing, and as a consequence, much more affordable housing, because the two are kind of tied together, at least through Section 8 and other tools like that. Then there is they don't have a housing crisis. They have a housing affordability crisis because the price of housing is too high. But they actually have built more than enough housing. And they do address the affordability crisis better than most places in California. So, it's still a disaster, but only, on a larger scale, like compared to like a European city. By Californian standards, it's the gold standard, right? Whereas whereas, you come to San Francisco and the Bay Area, you can't build any building over like a single story. You just can't do it. In Oakland, like there's a house across the street from me where for over 5 years, it's just been a shell. Because somebody's trying to triple the size or whatever. I've made the YIMBY movements. People are making progress in this sector. For instance, there's a law that allows everybody in California to build a granny flat, like a cottage, on their property. So adding one more bedroom to almost every 2 or 3 bedroom single unit estate in the thing. So that added a lot of housing. But that still doesn't address the kind of housing that's needed. And it still doesn't put the housing near where the jobs are. Yeah, that would be the mistake, right?
Usually, there's always been a problem with housing and the fact that there's always this sort of first mover advantage, whether it's a new country being formed or a new economic reform, and then you end up with a rentier class, and then that rentier class usually sets up a cabal, like a sort of like a scheme to manipulate the future laws and regulations around housing. And I've always found that sort of to be a cyclical idea, that there becomes an entrenched sort of rentier class that seeks to...
That is true, but where it's really met is with Wall Street and the Fed conspiring to keep interest rates so low that asset prices keep inflating.
So that's beautiful point.
That's a huge.
That's beautiful. I totally agree.
Of the quantitative easing thing that we described, that could very well be described as an initiative to prevent that loss of value that you just described in housing,
housing price
at the expense of workers. Yeah,
it's overpriced housing price inflation. They're paying like 3 or 4 times what the inflated prices of the assets will be. Yeah. And in an insane system.
And there's other ways. There are other ways to do this. In the Netherlands, where I used to live, they have an anti-squatting program that leases out homes that are and properties that are not being used on a very short-term contract at an artificially low price, to prevent what happened in 2009, 2010, a huge number of people being homeless, and also a huge number of homes being owned by banks that were not being utilized in any way.
Yep.
There's a lot of approaches to dealing with this kind of problem, and the United States has such a corporatocracy that we won't often entertain any of them.
Yeah, it's a huge issue. All right, so transport was another thing that you brought up. Let's go over to transport. I know India loves their trains, they love their boats, they love their planes. They love their cars. They like their roads, but their roads are pretty shoddy. What are you talking about? Socialized transport, some sort of access to transport, what to get the people to the jobs.
So yeah, in India, the intercity transport, the highways, actually they're very good. They've been a great success. So like I said, this government, especially the one we have now, Modi's government, they've actually done a very, very good job of macroeconomic reform. But the story has always been they've done the reform and the results have never shown up. And then now 3 or 4 times they were like, oh, we have to do one more reform before the results will magically show up. And it's only finally now that they've got to the very bottom, the entire tax system has been regularized, all the taxes are fair, customs has been opened up, the intercity roads have been completely developed and they're amazing, and there's still no trucks on them because there's no business. So yeah, actually the intercity transport in India is very good. The Each city also has a metro, like a subway, that's being built. But in the case, especially of Mumbai, it's a case of, I wouldn't say too little, too late. It's going to be a decent job, well done when it's finally done. But again, I don't think it's really planning for the future. It's barely meeting the demands of the present. And again, all these new transport systems, when you have a lower class whose wealth has literally been halved, and they were already the poorest people on earth from 2004 till now, and the cost of transport triples because all of a sudden it's a new train instead of like a 70-year-old line with a 30-year-old carriage running on it, they in many cases can't afford this transport. So in India, I think the big question of, I think the next decade after the mess with this government clears up is going to be transport subsidy.
Subsidy. Okay. And
Yeah,
is that
because how are people going to get around even on the cheapest transport when they're so poor they can't afford that?
Yeah, that's their entire salary.
Yeah.
so? What method of transport is good for India? I mean, because I know that there was a company doing microcars. A microcar is a good idea. What about the new electric car revolution and automobiles? Or should we stick with trains and try and maximize the train system?
Yeah, I mean, logically, India should have bullet trains and bicycles. Like, that would be the most environmentally conscious and sane approach for so many people. But practically speaking, cars are very popular among the class of people that can afford them. But then road capacity for that class of people has already reached, like, every city is just jammed with traffic. But I think the point here is that, again, anything you talk about in terms of India's success story affects only a really small sliver of the population, like 3, 5, 7%, right? So the remainder of people need to get around some way. And right now, I'm pretty sure they just simply don't get around, or when they do, it's on the roof of a train.
Wow.
Yeah, well, I know
on the back of a lorry.
roads are definitely, the road networks are definitely dominant. I mean, that's definitely a majority of how people. But freight, I'm not so sure about. I think trains might take a huge slice of the freight movement. How about airport?
I think actually in India, most of the traffic of trains is passengers, because, like I said, I have this very sneaky suspicion that aside from certain places, there just isn't that much freight. Like the manufacturing capacity of the country has not changed significantly since I was a teenager.
All right, what about airports?
Those are great, but again, we're only talking about people who can afford to fly. So,
Okay. All right,
Yeah.
cool. Sorry, Ben.
oh, actually, this problem has sort of, India's domestic airline policy was so open and competitive that originally there were 6 or 7 very popular, great airlines with a lot of service routes, but now at least 3 or 4 of them have collapsed in huge bankruptcies. So again, when you make a sector too competitive, you promote this sort of behavior. I don't know if in the case of Indian aviation, who's to blame, or if there is even anyone to blame, but demand for aviation is very high, but it's not being met as well as it was simply because most of the airlines have gone out of business.
Is it? Do you find it a problem when a company goes out of business? Do you worry about it?
It depends on the country. But yes, as I'm growing older, I'm discovering more and more that developed companies I don't know whether to think of them as good or bad, but they definitely developed their own entire pools of expertise and labor. And when the company goes away, those pools are shaken up. So it really depends on how robust the overall economy is in terms of then reacquiring those resources,
Because
right? If you are in a specialized industry where Hewlett Packard has, a complete domain over some sort of computer processing, like the kind of mainframes you use, for example, right, in your bank or whatever it is. Now all of a sudden, I believe Hewlett Packard's on the brink and it evaporates. If a company like that evaporates, that knowledge base entirely evaporates. So you have a whole infrastructure of people and businesses who are left adrift if it fails in the wrong way.
yeah, because there's so many, there's two or three different perspectives on this. In the United States, you had, Ben already mentioned the great financial crisis, and a lot of capitalists and capitalist people are saying, let those banks fail, don't bail out AIG, don't do all that because you're just promoting the bad actors. You're putting the bad actors on the government teat, so to speak. But then you got the other side, which is your argument, which is saying, well, these people need to wake up to a job in the morning. They need the talent pools there. In the case of the big banks, the mega banks, they are systemic to the global financial system. So it leaves people between a rock and a hard place. And banks are really not the best to talk about this because they do it on purpose. They integrate themselves into the matrix and then put the government on the line in order to get a bailout. And that's a really, really bad example. I like how you brought up Hewlett Packard or some tech or some other thing that's outside of the banking system. But if you do it for one, should you do it for the other? Ben Zion, what do you think about bailouts? Do you like bank bailouts? And then talk about other types.
What do you think about bailouts?
No, indeed, I do not like those bank bailouts, and I do think
and expand on other types of
describing as
bailouts.
It's a kind of scam where they've insinuated themselves into the system to such a degree that they are able to demand this large amount of money. That's essentially an extortion scheme, and I do think that what Aditya said, there's every country is different. The amount of infrastructure that might be lost by not taking that approach in one particular sector of the marketplace, maybe not banking, might be so substantial in a country like India that you would it's a different consideration that when we're describing in the what I would consider to be the travesty of this bailout in 2009.
Ben, putting the banks aside, let's just pick any other industry, some agricultural industry or high tech or the motor industry, for example, cars. What do you think about bailouts and intervention in that response?
I think I wanted to say that when you have state organized capitalism, which is something all of us seem to be trending towards, right? Even a federal land dividend, that's state organized capitalism. Then you pretty much have to approve of bailouts for various reasons in various sectors. So in that respect, then what is your policy?
There's a world of difference between those casino capitalists who run an extortion scheme in the case of banks and these other industries, which we do. We don't want to see that an entire industry is lost, particularly. But again, the biggest consideration is how many workers there are and what we can realistically do to preserve that marketplace. But generally speaking, we do have to make a high degree of considerations for that kind of protectionism, so far as it's not a literal extortion scheme on the part of people playing economic games.
Because there are many things to talk about, and Detroit sort of collapsed because of a liberalization policy where America refused to bail Detroit out. The car manufacturing started to collapse, and America took a hands-off approach. Detroit might not, as a city, the city itself might not be in the huge mess it is if America had have intervened at some point and said, actually, we're going to, bail. I mean, there's been like GM or something. I mean, there's been a few big corporations that have done it. But the problem I find, Aditya, and this is why I do like this idea of revisiting Karl Marx, is you end up with this reverse problem of socialism for the rich and capitalism for the very poor. Now, does that ring?
Sure, it's a great example.
Does that ring with you?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is, and that's what Marx explains is the problem, right? The bourgeoisie will bail themselves out, but there's this class of workers
Mm.
who are just perpetually oppressed.
Yeah, and it's not entirely clear to me, or I don't know that it's entirely clear to anyone. This is a story of the 20th century. This kind of a sort of arms race between automation and some kind of outsourcing of labor. In the case of Detroit, and there was almost no consideration for protecting those existing jobs in the United States. We just allowed those to dissipate. And this city is a husk of its former self of 50 years ago. As a result, this is not just a problem of Detroit; it's a problem of the entire Rust Belt of the United States, and it's a huge number of folks who have suffered for this. And we have to seriously consider how we can take care of folks moving forward to see that, and maybe we don't have as many options as we might have some decades ago with that sort of thing. We have a different set of concerns. Something like more novel economic policies like the federal land dividend or many others, which are very, very fine. We might have to view these as more extreme measures because we don't have that middle class worker base that we once had.
Yeah, well, you know, when I get really concerned when I see a hollowing out, when I see a scooping out of these jobs, because it impacts, you know, the people, the families, the family unit, the structure of the society in that area in a negative way. It's not just about some guy who goes to a factory and has a job. It actually impacts the social, you know, the spiritual, the harmony of the nation. And then you end up, what happens is these people feel disenfranchised, and then they turn to loud, bombastic voices who blame other people. And when you're talking about a country like the United States, with a superpower and nuclear weapons and other things, that can turn a situation from an economic situation of whether or not a factory exists in nowhere's land, or, you know, whether or not you go to another war because those people feel disenfranchised. It changes the political debate in a country. Ben Zion, you mentioned the Rust Belt. What do you say? This is one of the reasons that I predicted and wrote that Donald Trump was going to win over and over again, because it changes the political conversation.
Yes, these people are hurting, and a sham populist message on the part of someone like Donald Trump, who did precisely the opposite in terms of enfranchising workers in almost every undertaking that his administration has set itself to. But these people were hurting, and they heard someone making these hollow yet bombastic economic populist messages. And we should draw a distinction between that kind of bombast of somebody who is clearly a con artist, and then maybe somebody like Senator Sanders or others who seem legitimately devoted to fixing those problems. And we do need to focus on actual solutions and not be running around like chickens with their heads cut off as a population.
Karl Marx again he speaks about all these concerns as well, mostly because of his age, you know, of the 1840s, 1850s, also experienced amazing amounts of automation, right? That's when the looms and like industrial revolution. So they saw their own version of this effects and, you know, the thing. And he said that when this first starts to happen, when the oppression starts to become apparent and it crosses a tipping point in the transferred to the upper ends of the bourgeoisie. I wish there was a better term than bourgeoisie, but it's the one he uses, right? Which is the one that we keep just talking about, that we use socialism for the rich, and now it's just socialism for the super rich, and even the rich are starting to prey upon each other, and gradually the class of who is poor becomes larger. He says when that happens, the rage of the poor people is usually split into two groups. One is reactionary. They want things to go back to the way they were. And the other is revolutionary. They just want to burn everything down and start over. And I think Donald Trump is really speaking to the reactionary wing, especially the older people who remember when, even though things physically look the same, they were much more comfortable.
Mm.
And that appeal, that's why he polls so badly amongst younger people, for example, because they don't believe these
Yeah,
hollow
they don't accept that false nostalgic narrative.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really good point. What was the this is a great conversation, by the way. Thank you so much, Aditya, for coming on Detonation and talking. What was the next thing reform that you had an idea? So we've gone through minimum wage, transport, we've gone through affordable housing. What was the other one? Labor, right?
We had minimum wage, affordable housing, being able to commute to work, yeah, which was transport.
We had some discussion about more specific ideas, some more specific ideas about visa policies in other countries that would facilitate. That would facilitate.
I think visa policies in all countries attached to the global economy pretty much have to be that if there's a job available, a qualified candidate can take it from anywhere. I mean, you can add a few more hoops than that, especially when the demand is so much greater than the supply. It has to be metered. Right. So like in the case of the United States, you can't just have half of India just move here in 1 year. So especially for semi-skilled labor, you'd have to do what they currently do with the H-1B, where by country there'd be an allotment in a total pool of allowed immigrants, where the total amount would be capped at 1% of the population or 2% of the population or whatever. And they would just hand them out to people as per, the queue. And that would pretty much be the entire system. And there would still have to be another ladder within it for people to be able to climb the ladder somehow through exceptional cases of merit, and that would be pretty much it, right? But the purpose of that system would be, if that existed, all over the world, wages everywhere would become much fairer, because companies would know everybody has a choice, employees would know that they would have a choice. Everybody, once they know they have a choice, they behave very differently.
Ben, if you want to just comment on that, but I do want to ask you a follow-up question, Ben, after you make that comment.
No, I was just going to say that this potentially tens of millions of workers, these would be highly trained engineers, desirable in the marketplace and of great benefit to a country like the United States. And yet we've seen a move away from allowing these folks into the country as easily. And this is this sort of border wall constellation of concerns, this kind of isolationist of the worst kind, this kind of nativist notion. This is, again, a feature of this sort of demagogue, the sham populist, who is, as you said, making reactionary rather than ultimately any kind of truly progressive arguments.
The thing is, there's no doubt that for skilled labor, you should allow immigration pretty much of the kind you said. If a company has a vacancy, they can't fill it with an American worker, they should just be allowed to hire a foreign worker. I'm saying that in order for these inequities in the system to more or less even out, you kind of have to have the same thing in semi-skilled labor too. So the same way, if there's a job in rural America and no American is willing to fill it because it's in the middle of nowhere, you should just allow an immigrant to do it legally, as opposed to as now they're doing it illegally. I think when you do that, you will find that not that many people actually want to immigrate to the United States. Like, there's a significant few million people who are being boxed out, and these people are very significant because the upper echelon of them drive huge amounts of job growth. Like the American economy, innovation economy, relies on immigrants to work, right? And that supply has been throttled because of Donald Trump's regressive policies, right? And that supply is not guaranteed. It's based on America being the most attractive place to emigrate to, which the longer you pursue this stupid policy, the worse it gets, right? It's a unique competitive advantage that is being eroded. But aside from that, the rest of the people, what should the policy be?
It's interesting to contextualize this because we have Donald Trump has initiated a trade war with China, an effective trade war with Central America, wherein we don't have the workers of migrant workers coming and maintaining the agricultural systems that we had. And there are people in the transhumanist party and futurists who I would tend to describe as people who have a different view than myself, people who would be center-right automation hardliners, who would say that we should just absorb that cost. that damage to the supply chain and agricultural system, that increase in prices that results from this trade war, that we should absorb that cost in the near term because automation will pick up the slack as a result of that vacuum. What do you say to those folks? The idea that
automation
full automation can solve this problem.
That's a stupid argument because inevitably automation will pick up all the slack, no matter what.
It's just a question.
The trend of automation is unstoppable, right? The thing is, if you have a high minimum wage and decent labor protections, that's the best bet you have for managing the transition. And high labor protections and a high minimum wage, also the minimum wage can't be so high, although currently it's laughable to even think about because minimum wage is so low compared to what it should be. But if it's too high, it does actually, it's bad for the economy as well. In other ways, but that's really a straw man argument right now because no such situation exists anywhere in the West.
It's a far future thought experimentation. It's far future thought experimentation in service to a non-solution.
Yeah, no, I mean it is something to think about. No, I mean yeah. We were talking about immigration. I'm sorry, I lost the thread.
All right, Ben's on.
So you have another question too.
Yeah, so Ben's on. You know, thinking about the USTP people, you know, we come from all parts of the spectrum, but some people advocate this notion of post-nationalism and a 20th century sort of idea, which Aditya is talking about, is international organizations like the WTO and the World Trade Organization, etc., World Health Organization, are kind of assisting in liberalizing movements, but then you have national policy swinging in and making it harder for this transition of labor. And Aditya is saying that needs to be.
I had a point that I'd also like you to speak about, which was actually which is related to this. That where I lost my train of thought, which was that currently the visa system for skilled labor in the United States is enormously tilted, and I think overall this is bad for the economy. It's enormously tilted in favor of the employer, right? And the employer in all cases is almost always a huge corporation because they're the only ones who are able to make commitments that are this huge. So anybody who's on an H-1B, they're not allowed to start their own business. Under Donald Trump, their spouses are no longer allowed to work legally in the United States, which is ridiculous, just completely ridiculous, right? And then the main thing is, if you really want to unlock human capital, these people should be able to move to the United States, leave again, move back, leave again, just depending on where the job takes them, right? So that they can be the most efficient. And this is something that the skilled labor policy of the United States specifically disallows to, in my opinion, great detriment.
Yeah, it's because Donald Trump has an America First policy, so he's trying to fill the shoes with American workers, which we can't do, right? But he's trying.
Yeah, it's not even.
He's trying to prove a point that doesn't exist.
When you get a visa from a company, then you can't leave that company. You're basically indentured over there, right? If you want to switch jobs, you have to find another employer to give you a job offer and go through all this paperwork in order to switch. It's almost like you're immigrating all over again. It's slightly easier, but not particularly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we should say that this America First set of policies, for example, in this China trade war, these are reactionary and thoughtless power plays that have a negative effect on enfranchising any of those Americans who he wants to be advancing first. Those people have lost their jobs. Entire subsets of manufacturing, steel, and so forth have tens of thousands of jobs that have been lost because of this trade war. It's not really about America First. It's just about Donald Trump kind of making this insane power play.
Yeah, so what I was going to say before is, so this sort of 20th century idea of WTO and the World Trade Organization and other things, there was trying to a movement there for a while of internationalism, liberalization, what you sort of called globalization before. So what would you say? What would you say to Aditya's idea of this sort of post-nationalism? In a transhumanist perspective, post-nationalism on labor relations, do you speak on that, post-nationalism in the world of labor reform?
Yes. That's a very hard thing to game out. Um, we kind of have these drop in the bucket effects that you just described, where if we try to think about what the effects of liberalization of groups of laborers might be, we will tend to see things that have already been described here, where capital is well served, and workers don't see much of an advance in their median earnings. So that's a serious concern. I'm not running for president of Earth. I'm running for president of the United States. So
yeah, but here's a specific example. I'm a software engineer in the Bay Area, a senior one. My median wage for people for like not median, but I guess a decent wage for people around here, in my capacity would be like $150,000 to $250,000 a year, right? I know that the same person in India earns 1/5 of that. So if you had an unlimited skilled wage policy, you would be taking my wages and reducing them by at least a third, and that's all that would be happening from my perspective.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So I don't think like even opening up skilled labor, either the whole market has to be made fairer and people have to understand that, or you're going to have an absurd amount of people up in arms because everybody who's currently in the professional working classes is suddenly going to find that an immigrant can replace them.
Yeah, some kind of protectionism is in order here, and we can criticize how the Trump administration has approached this, or really been quite ham-fisted on this. But we need to see that workers in this country don't continue to lose their wages. At the same time, something like the a kind of example that we talked about before that maybe illustrates this in a roundabout way was we were talking about mass transit. We were talking about specifically the idea that this is a greening effort of making mass transit free. So if you consider that countries that have made mass transit free remove the paywall. The paywall, so to speak, is a great part of the expense of maintaining these systems. So if you automate those systems and remove the paywall and do the sort of thing that Aditya said, where you're not having working people at the lowest levels paying this poor tax constantly that's exorbitant. This is an approach this instead as a free good. This has a very good effect on this economic climate in that area. We can kind of describe this in terms of something like the federal land dividend. We want to focus on seeing that people are living well and starting small businesses through a program like this, and maybe instead of focusing too much on protectionism, allow for automation and advancement to take place at the quickest level, but also have an alternate system that allows for the maintenance and strengthening of the middle class.
But I have a question for you. What small business is actually profitable?
Well, I mean, there's if we think of all of the folks that do have sole proprietorships and partnerships that make a living from that, is something like the federal land dividend. That's any married couple would be receiving $104,000 a year. They could be doing professional development of different kinds. A lot of those small businesses that I imagine those folks would be starting would quickly turn into going concerns. It comes down to these questions of whether we are valuing the state of the Dow Jones, or whether we are valuing what Andrew Yang refers to as the real economy, folks doing good things and starting things in their lives.
$4,000 will really help people, develop their human capital without debt. But that's something they can already do with very cheap debt. Just keep that in mind. And I also am concerned that, except in certain professional services that are linked to the government or the judicial system, almost every small business has been wiped out by the internet. Not almost every, but there's been a significant decline. And again, if you go back to Karl Marx, he calls this class of people man, this is another such a weird term, but the actual phenomenon is real and it is actually really occurring. The petty bourgeoisie, right? So these are people who are, in the working class but have somehow been lifted out and are usually managing a small business. And he describes in his writings that these people keep falling back into the working class because their going concerns rarely succeed. And I think just like the way I think the chance of restaurant success is like 1 in 20 or something like that in a developed market with a lot of people going to restaurants. We're not even talking about like small towns. Like in San Francisco, your chance of a restaurant being successful is like 5%. And that's exactly the kind of business most people will go to start, like a coffee shop or whatever, right? With odds like that, they're pretty much guaranteed to waste their money. Most people will take this $104,000 and just pay down their existing debt.
Yeah.
Just be exactly where they are.
Yeah. I should say that that is a serious concern. And if people were using this to start a cobbler business or a toaster repair business or something, but I would imagine that most of those people are going to be doing 21st century undertakings, working in design and computer science to a high degree.
The toaster business and cobbler business, the repair and thing, those are interesting ideas, but those don't work because of the huge concentration of manufacturing and subsidized transport in China.
And the fact that the manufacturers set up the planned obsolescence and the fact that they like to do all the fixing themselves in order to get extra cash, and the fact that sometimes it's just cheaper to send it overseas and get it returned in the mail than it is to hire the guy down the street.
Yeah. I don't imagine that these folks setting up these fledgling sole proprietorships and partnerships and cooperative forms of businesses, all very fine forms of businesses relative to the corporatist system, in some sense, the truer forms of a free market, in my view. But I don't imagine those folks are going to be really placing themselves in direct competition with the Amazons and these gigantic concerns. They'll be doing things more on the order of the kinds of things that folks in Silicon Valley are doing in incubators and so forth. Working
one-time check of $104,000.
No. This is the federal land dividend is $52,000 for every 18 to 63-year-old. Moving forward. So the federal land dividend
annually or one time?
Annually.
Annually.
Wow.
Yeah, okay.
It's funded through these a land lease program. There are 40% of lands in the entire United States are nationalized, and those are valued at hundreds of trillions of dollars. We can lease those to carbon neutral companies that maintain a specific aesthetic relative to the natural world, and because they're held in such large numbers, we approximate $173 trillion over the course of 10 years, which would be enough to fund this basic income scheme that I've described without contributing to concerns like hyperinflation or without having to raise corporate tax rates, which should be raised. But this is the kind of thing that we need to be doing now so that we can avoid something like a jobless apocalypse, a robot apocalypse, these concerns of 55% of workers having their jobs automated out of existence over the next 15 years or so.
Cool.
What is going to be the issue in India? Are you worried about, because you're talking about minimum wage, raising the minimum wage? Do you worry about the jobless apocalypse in India anyway? Because what if you, where are you going to go? Are these low skilled people going to compete? You mentioned before, Aditya, that that robots aren't quite as advanced yet to take those low service jobs, but they are coming. Do you worry that there's going to be an automation apocalypse in India, or do you think the government just might put an automation tax and just slow it down for the sake of, again, social stability?
The thing is, India is a very complicated place, and honestly, many things that, seem like a detriment could be a boon if they were just applied correctly. Definitely, I think in the case of India, when automation arrives, it'll have to be implemented and the rewards socialized completely. So that goes without saying. So more than any country, I think on earth, the argument for just sharing gains There's a huge case for socialism in India, and there always has been, because there's a huge swath of the population, more than half of it, probably more than two-thirds of it, who will forever need to be subsidized to live. Uh, Food, housing, everything, just literally they will have to be subsidized. There's no economic system that I've been able to imagine uh, will these people directly become productive unless they retrain themselves significantly. And for them, that's a huge challenge in and of itself.
Aditya, what do you say about democracy in India? Do you think it's been a help or an inhibitor?
I mean, definitely. The only thing you can compare it to is the British Empire. So, of course, it's a great help.
What do you mean? What do you mean by that?
Before democracy, there was the empire for 250 years. So, there's nothing else there's no other system of government. I don't.
What
think
about the Mughal? What about the Mughal Empire?
Yeah, they were there before the British, but I mean, I guess the big difference between all empires prior to the British Empire is they didn't exploit wealth. There was no actual transfer of wealth out of the country.
No formalized legal system for it.
I mean, they were all feudal systems, so they were all exploitative of the lower classes, like all feudal systems are. But India was still the richest country on earth at that time, so I guess the effects were not really felt, except at the very lowest levels. Everybody is materially and spiritually fairly comfortable. The Industrial Revolution and imperialism, which came hand in hand, by that standard, are a massive disaster. There's, a politician and economist, Shashi Tharoor, he's just written a book about, he's done some decent calculations on what the final amount of wealth extraction is. It's some absurd number, like $17 trillion or something like that over the course of, the empire. And it's true, it's been hollowed out. And then, India turned inward on itself, thinking that a very venal form of, socialism would somehow work, which I guess really was not a very good idea, but seemed acceptable at the time. And then, we finally broke free of that into this world of, fairly unfettered capitalism. You can get a land use permit for anything that's outside the city. You can, you have decent roads everywhere. You can transport things. You can import things into the country and export them out of the country. It's just there's not enough capital or access to capital. And, things are, like I said, for most of the country, twice as bad as they were in 2004. So, but then there's another class which has done fairly well, which has done well. Like computer programmers, for instance, went from their wages being 1/8 to 1/15 their wages in the United States to 1/3 to 1/5, which again is too low, but at least they have really, risen up. And their wages by world standards are still the lowest, but they're still decent. Like a computer programmer makes between $30,000 and $50,000 a year,
Let's quickly touch on some foreign policy. So you're mentioning India, and you said that the middle class isn't going to be big enough to become a consumer class. In China, that's a different country. In America, you are a consumer nation. That's all you do. What about around you? What about, you said Bangladesh is doing okay in relative terms. What about Pakistan as well? Sri Lanka, Nepal? What about all these other countries that are around you? You've got a lot of countries, Myanmar, which is a closed country. It's opening up. Do you see any potential for these to help hinder? Any lessons you can learn for India?
Yeah, there are lessons, but India is different from all of them in that it's unlikely to learn any lesson whatsoever. It's just a different level of undiscipline, and the same thing, in India, like the government that came in 2005, one of the things they did it really stunned me, and it's really something that Donald Trump and people like him are doing in America too, and people from this entire school of government and of governing, they actually think like this because they're thinking in terms of power and exploitation. They're not actually thinking in terms of the rule of law ever. Right? So one of the first things powerful people do who are afraid, who want to extract the most from the people beneath them without regard to the consequence, is beneath them, they unleash every single regional and local mafia they can. Right? Because the minute lawlessness starts at the bottom level and the medium level and the medium level, then lawlessness at the top level is just completely obscured by so many layers of lawlessness. right? So in 2005 we had a government from 98 till 2004. The government
Reminds
said
me of
police should-
Ferguson. But could go on.
Yeah, but this is something Sonia Gandhi, and she's Italian, I don't know, but she must be from a mafia family or know mafia politics well, like understand them. She, it's the first thing, I mean, she wasn't actually the prime minister, Manmohan Singh was, but she was the head of the party and she was unofficially the leader of the country for about 10 years. It's the first thing she did, is in every single place, every single regional mafia were told, you can just run riot. So we really have a governance problem with corruption in India that is honestly, I mean, who can say it's the greatest corruption problem on earth? Because now even the American corruption has reached, this standard. So I guess they're both unique in being the greatest form of corruption on earth because it's so large and so out of hand in such distinctive ways. So until that beast is muzzled, the country can't develop because somebody's got their hands in the pocket of somebody else and they'll stop at nothing.
It reminds me of what Modi did in Gujarat. Oh, is it whatever his state was called? Yeah, Gujarat, right? When he allowed the rioters to run riot, right?
Sort of, but that was just more straight authoritarianism and fascism in terms of allowing, the bad people to. It's like allowing the white people to lynch the black person. You're enforcing the authoritarian. In a way, it's enforcing the rule of law.
Because as far as I understand it, he didn't say a word. He didn't really denounce it. He didn't encourage it. He just sort of sat back and
the police just vanished. The police just vanished on the day of a riot. Yeah, but while he consciously did that, he's enforcing the rule of law more than he's the actual state of the law, as opposed to what's written in the books. He's actually enforcing conservatism of society rather than what like. So the first thing that when these regional mafias do, in America, you see the same thing with private prisons and prisons for undocumented children and things like that, is none of these people have a conscience because they've literally come for the exploitation. So when the government, opened up the, freedom to this level of exploitation at every level, like one of the first things is there's this Indian gangster. He was killed in 2007, I think. He was shot down in his home. Somebody took him out with an assault rifle, him and his whole family. What it turns out, what he was doing is India had a very large program to give mothers. So India has the most number of babies in the world that die due to malnourishment. Okay, and most number of babies lost during pregnancy because of malnourishment. So at some point in the 90s, the government set up a program to guarantee every mother with a child younger than 6 months, every pregnant woman and mother with a child less than 6 months, 2 square meals a day. Right, so the government would guarantee this. So even though that the number of people we're talking about is like 200 million, and that's the order of cost of 50 cents a day, that's a huge subsidy. They decided to go ahead and do it anyway, just because of how big the problem was, right? And I mean, it's not 200 million; it's smaller than that, but it is a very large subsidy. So when Sonia Gandhi came into power, one of the first things was at that time they used to give the mothers dal and rice, which is just cooked, lentils and rice together. It's a staple food of India. So somebody made an objection, and this is how corruption works. There has to be a piece of paper that allows you to change the system because whatever, that said that these meals of dal and rice are not nutritionally complete for growing mothers, which is actually a fact, right? So the government mandated that on top of the dal and rice, you would have to sprinkle in nutritional powder so that it would become completely nutritional. So it's like a multivitamin powder. So then what they did is they devolved the power to administer and run this program to each state so that each state could have its own corrupt mafia come into this food production system, right? This is what I'm talking about, the devolution. And then in many of the states, these mafias successfully lobbied to replace the meal with just the powder. So all of a sudden, these mothers, instead of getting a meal of dal and rice, are just getting the powder that originally used to be, because the powder is nutritionally complete. So they're like, why do they need the meal, right? And then this guy was in 7 states, well, at least in 2 of them, 2 of the largest in India, was selling fake powder. So the powder was not actually multivitamin, it was just like cornstarch or whatever. Yeah. So it's like with the undocumented children prisons, it's the same thing, and it's as vicious. It's just in India, it's applied more domestically, more shamelessly because of a different cultural context. But fundamentally, it's the same thing. And yeah, I don't know.
Benzine, you got a huge problem there in the United States with police violence. Cops doing their own thing. They run their own little what do you call them? Counties, like their own little gangs over there in the United States.
little
And then
jurisdictions.
the media always around the world, the media always amplifies any of this police violence out of proportion, to black and white and the distribution. They turn it into a circus, and they underreport other sorts of crimes that are going on, especially within the same context. It's a huge mess. But like Aditya was saying, is this because you've got corruption on the highest levels, and they're making a circus over this low-level stuff? And also, what do you do about police crime in the United States?
Yeah. Well, it should be said that the FBI's warnings about white nationalists infiltrating these local police organizations have time and time again gone unheeded. And that is a significant concern here. A lot of these other concerns do derive from poor insight into our actions in the wake of the events following September 11th, 2001, where we allowed these local police forces to become increasingly more and more militarized. This is an unhealthy set of institutions to evolve in this direction, and this, in conjunction also with problems of the kind like a sort of economically predatory set of behaviors. We see in Ferguson, there was the events that led up to the concerns there was police time and time again targeting people of color and lower income individuals with insanely punitive fines over and over again. This is a feature of many of these institutions, is that they're not offering any real service. They're just stealing money from people over and over again. And this is, again, a form of poor tax, because it's not just being distributed across society, across all of these folks. It's targeting people who can afford it the least. And this is a tremendous set of concerns and things that we need to fix in these institutions at the local level, and we can be legislating for this to a high degree at the federal level. But there's it may not be this precise same kind of problem that we're talking about, this sort of strongman phenomena at the local level that Aditya described so articulately, but it's a strongman phenomena nevertheless, and it's something that we need to address.
I think specifically in the United States, there's two major pieces of reform that need to be institutionalized in order to somewhat corral the domestic surveillance state and the domestic abuse of power by the executive branch of the government, right? Because you can see this power and it keeps increasing and increasing. It's because there's no way to question the executive's action. Like if a policeman comes, like police brutality is just one symbol of it, but you see it in your parking tickets. You see it in every executive action. In a civil action, there's two parties. You can just participate. You pay for a lawyer, they pay for a lawyer, and it's all guns blazing. You go for each other. Whenever you're taking on the government, whether it's the Federal Bureau of Investigation, your local police force, your local county cop, it's all linked in one big system, thanks to innovations made after Homeland Security and 2001. But that whole system is designed just to bully you.
Yeah,
and yeah. No, it is. It is innovation. It's innovation corruption.
It's very
innovative
ways
bullying.
of
Prosecutorial bullying is what it is. Yeah, but it's not necessarily a progressive innovation, right? Yeah, but it's innovation nonetheless.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's two things that need to be done. One is the Freedom of Information Act, which is an act that is actually very powerful. It simply states that all public records of these public institutions actually belong to the public, right? So it's a very powerful piece of legislation, and it's done wonders. But the main thing is it lacks no enforcement action, and there's no other party to audit that it's functioning as expected. So in fact, the FBI in particular has a deliberate policy of never answering a FOIA request. So, because there's no enforcement action, so what are you going to, tell the FBI exactly? Yeah. you know, yeah. So I think one thing that really needs to be done is that the Freedom of Information Act really needs to have teeth attached to it, because it's a wonderful act, but it just doesn't have any thing attached to it. And the second thing is, I think in America at the very highest level, acts of you need a right to civil disobedience. So in India, actually, this is one thing that we have that I always took for granted, is because of Mahatma Gandhi and the way that we opposed British rule, which was largely through hunger, fasting, and public demonstrations, which were non-violent in nature. Right? It's the same as like I block traffic on a street, or there's an infraction that's silly, I keep doing it over and over. I actually have a right to do it. So I'd met a famous American rights activist. His name is Ryan Shapiro, and he came up as an animal rights activist in New York City in the 90s. And he said back then, I guess I didn't know this until now, most of the factory farms, they're in upstate New York, like a lot of them, like a couple hours north of New York City. So every weekend, him and a bunch of other activists, they would gang up at their coffee shop. They'd be like, okay, who has a car? And they would go up to upstate and they would just release the animals, right? It was like almost like a monthly prank for them. And every now and then the cops would catch them and they would get arrested. And then, they'd have to spend the weekend in the prison. Monday morning, they would see the judge and the judge would be like, it's you guys again, like get out of here, right? So there was this whole culture of permissiveness around infractions that also incorporated your rights. And because this culture existed, a lot of people were able to exert their rights, especially against the police and against local institutions, just informally by saying like, no, I have rights, like back off, right? But now, instead, the FBI is directly linked, and the secret state is directly linked, and Department of Homeland Security is directly linked to all of these organizations, and everything is computerized. So all of a sudden, these same systems have become totalitarian systems of control. So, for example, before the FBI made white supremacy its number one target, which it only did after, the president became a public white supremacist, the second largest domestic target is actually ecological terrorists and animal rights activists. Okay, and the animal products industries, like the meat industry and several others, have lobbied to introduce 2 or 3 different pieces of congressional legislation that make it an act of domestic terrorism to perform a first, second, or third step crime against any business that uses animal products or its derivatives. So there is a girl who's been charged with domestic terrorism, okay, for writing in chalk on the wall outside a 7-Eleven, right? And everything that now is like an example, in 10 years, it just becomes fact because that's the way the system is designed. So it now turns out to be the case that if you are an activist in these categories, ecological terror, like you're protesting again, like for the environment, or you're protesting for the rights of animals, and you decide to take it, to a domain like just some nonviolent place like that may interfere with somebody else's activities, you will now by default be charged with an act of terrorism.
Wow, that's disturbing.
I think it's pretty incredible that the people who would build a pipeline that could contribute substantively to the pollution of the earth are not regarded as eco-terrorists, but the people who would attempt to resist that might be classed as such. It's an incredibly paradoxical thing.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's fine to be charged as such as long as, you get your day in court and you have rights that support your position. Yes. Right? Yeah. So the point is right now, those rights, they are unvoiced, and the legal infrastructure is expanded to terrorize people through surveillance and through computerization. And just generally, the climate has become much more hostile because the government has just become more and more lawless. Sheriff Joe is free and whatnot. In Phoenix, you must obviously relate to this. Like a sheriff who's famous for his brutality is now back on the streets. So, a SEAL who, is, posing for trophy photos with decapitated Islamic State members is now being, freed from his. Yeah, it's all being done on purpose because it's the same line of thinking that when you allow lawlessness to then at the top the lawlessness goes checked.
Yeah. So let's start to wrap it up. Let's go back to the top of the hour. Let's go back to the top of the point. This revisiting Karl Marx. That's the name of this episode. We're talking about Karl Marx because India's got some systemic problems, and you're thinking that labor reform and certain other reforms as well. Did you want to just cap off your argument, your point about what you were talking about at the outset, Aditya? And thank you again for coming on Detonation. It's been an absolute honor, absolute pleasure, and we hope to see you again here really, really soon because this is such a fascinating topic.
Yeah, thank you so much for your kind words. And thanks for inviting me, Ben, and having me steal. Yeah, so I came on here because I grew up in a failing socialist country that had just opened up and that had a rich tradition of being connected to the Western world. We all speak English, we have all these like cultural links. And over time, the government, though it's made many missteps and it's become incredibly corrupt, it has actually enacted the fundamental, deep structural reforms, opened up the market, made everything fair, liberalized everything, made the tax structure exceedingly fair, allowed the free flow of capital in and out, like to an incredible level. And nevertheless, most of the country is half as rich as it was in 2004. The poorest people are just poorer and poorer than they ever were before. And where they're seemingly not, they're usually mired in debt, high interest debt at that. And then I've also, lived in the United States where when I came to the United States, everyone had a cultural expectation. You don't like college, you just quit. You just go start working in a job. You'll be able to provide for yourself. You'll be able to live. And I've tried that myself and just failed. And I had, parents to support me. So I went back to college. But I was just like, this is weird. Like, it doesn't add up. But then as an adult, these problems have come into my life as well. Like anybody around me who's on the minimum wage, their lives are just falling apart. And they're, running on this treadmill. They're part of an economic class I'm coming to call the precariat. Mm-hmm. So over time, I'm coming to realize more and more, I'm coming to sympathize with everything Karl Marx said. And more, I'm starting to see his study of the picture of capitalism as very, very insightful. I don't know yet about the other side of it, and no one can speak to the success of communist states because there are no successful communist states, right? And it was an epic disaster culturally for everybody. But there's no denying that the problems that he speaks of are real about systems that just consume, like all the wealth gets transferred. We now call the same thing global inequality. And it's a real transnational problem. And the one thing that I've come to realize after trying to fix it at a high level in many ways myself and finding that the system just won't support it is I'm more and more at this time coming to see that ultimately the revolution, the change, the advocacy for it has to come from the people who are most affected. So inspiring them, training them, and giving them the ability to organize and connecting their voices around the world is the only way we can actually improve the lot of the average man.
Workers of the world, rise up. That's what you're saying. That's the message coming out of it.
Yeah, and articulating that precariat, describing these people who are at a group of people who are economically insecure. It's a huge class of folks in this United States, and it's not just a coincidence. It's a set of circumstances that's been engineered by a lack of concern for humane economic policies and pro-worker initiatives. And this is something that has to be reversed. And it's something where we almost are at a point where we cannot address this as we could have some decades ago, which is why I think we do need novel approaches, things on the order of magnitude of the federal land dividend, if not other approaches that might try to address this concern in other ways. I laud you for describing those folks, because those 55% of people, of workers in this country who are working in service jobs at an artificially low wage, for example, they are kind of in a living hell. And it's only going to get worse unless we take a dramatically different tack.
And, Detonation is an early mover on the USTP. And, we know that there's a lot of the economic problems. We can sort out a lot of the problems through the utilization of the United States Transhumanist Party. And it's also why we're really, really proud to support Benzion 2020 in this idea. But also thanks to Zoltan Itzvan for going into the conservative side, this GOP side and opening up the door on some of these issues, basic income and other things included. So it's a really big change here in America. It's changing fast. It's changing quick. And thanks to Aditya for coming on and highlighting the problems. Thanks again, Benzion 2020, for your continuing campaign, your continuing support of Detonation and everything. Aditya, lovely to talk to you. Fantastic. I hope to see you again really soon.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Really incredible insights. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for the invite. Take it
All
easy,
right.
guys.
No problem. Thank you very much. It's Detonation, where we're putting death out of business. Thanks for everybody.